Our story begins in 1316 with the birth of Magnus Eriksson. His father was Duke Erik Magnusson, and his mother was the daughter of the King of Norway. His father was the brother to the current King of Sweden, Birger. But when the King of Sweden was deposed by the nobility because he starved his brothers to death, Magnus was elected as their king. The King of Norway also died the same year, and because he didn't have any sons, Magnus was elected by the Norwegian nobility as their king. This resulted in a personal union between the countries, making it the biggest country in Europe at the time. But Magnus was ambitious. He wanted Scania from Denmark, and that outcome was actually pretty probable. The King of Denmark had run into an economic downturn, which forced him to pledge most of his holdings to German lords. Scania had been pledged to John of Holstein, but John's rule of Scania was very unpopular with the peasantry, because of his use of German bailiffs, which the population saw as an attack on their livelihood. A revolt would follow, in which a delegation from the Bishop of Lund declared that they would rather be governed by Sweden, and this revolt would force John of Holstein to sell Scania and Blekinge to Magnus for 34,000 marks. Over in Denmark, there is a new king, Valdemar IV, and he is very displeased, and he does not recognize the purchase of Scania by Sweden. This results in a brief war that ended in 1343, with Valdemar having to recognize Scania Blekinge as Swedish. Back in Sweden, Magnus is now broke after his purchase of Scania Blekinge and his brief war with Valdemar, and he faces excommunication because he has borrowed money from the church. He has also borrowed money from the nobility, and now they start to become worried about his rule, so they turned to his son Erik and told him that he could have the crown if he supported their plot. Magnus, of course wanting his crown back, entered a treaty with his old enemy, Valdemar, but as the treaty had been signed, Erik suddenly died, and Magnus became the new king of Sweden again. King Valdemar of course felt very deceived and betrayed by Magnus and initiated a campaign against Scania. This time Valdemar was very successful. This led to more displeasement from the nobility against Magnus, and thus his second son Håkan imprisoned him and was to become king, but he and Magnus came to an agreement to rule together. To end the war between Sweden and Denmark, Valdemar demanded Håkan to marry his daughter Margaret. With peace, Håkan now wanted to solidify his control of Sweden. To do this, he sentenced many nobles into exile for conspiring to capture or kill the king. What Håkan did not expect was that these nobles obviously don't want to be thrown into exile, so they united and invited Håkan's cousin and promised him that he could have the Swedish crown. In November of that year, he arrived with an army to Stockholm and was elected king in February of 1364. But Håkan and Magnus were able to retreat to Norway. From there, they launched a military attack on eastern Svealand, but were defeated in the Battle of Åsle in 1365. Their ally, Valdemar, came in and helped launch an offensive and initially achieved great success. However, he was eventually attacked by Mecklenburg, Holstein and Hanseatic troops, leading to a peace agreement. Now Albert controlled Sweden, whilst Norway was controlled by Håkan and his father. Magnus died in 1374 and Valdemar died the next year, but the intended heir of Denmark did not succeed him. Instead, Håkan put forward his own son, Olof, to be the successor, and that Norway would be ruled by him, whilst Denmark would be ruled by his wife, Margaret. until Olof came of age. This was accepted by the Danish nobility. But Håkan died in 1380. This resulted with Margaret as the sole regent to Olof. To strengthen her claim to the throne, she began calling herself Queen of Denmark, Sweden and Norway. A war between Sweden and Denmark broke out for control of Scania. Over in Sweden, the support of Albert as the King of Sweden had faded, like it usually does. To support him, he had called upon Germans to act as country lords and bailiffs instead of the Swedish aristocracy. Of course, this had angered them. A domestic crisis followed where Albert tried to solidify his control by taking the inheritance of one of Sweden's most powerful lords. But his inability to conquer Scania did not favor his cause, and many Swedish nobles turned to Margaret for support. Through the Dalaborg Treaty, Margaret was recognized as Sweden's authorized lady and true mistress by the gathered Swedish nobility. But in the same year, Olof suddenly fell ill and died. But how is it going for Albert? Well, Albert did not remain passive as opposition against him grew stronger. In late summer of 1388, he traveled to Mecklenburg to gather a significant force of entirely mounted and well-equipped mercenaries. In the autumn, the forces of the opposition besieged Axevalla House outside Skara, and Albert's troops marched via Jönköping to relieve it. Margaret's and Albert's forces met near Åsle Church village, a mile east of Falköping. What followed was the Battle of Åsle, which became both a military and political victory for Margaret, when both Albert and his son Erik was captured. With Albert defeated, a large assembly of nobles gathered in Helsingborg. Margaret aimed to create a union between the nations and presented the new heir to the throne, Erik of Pomerania, the son of Margaret's niece. The nobility of Denmark, Norway and Sweden accepted him as their future king. In the summer of 1397, a meeting was held in Kalmar, Sweden, where representatives from each nation gathered. The meeting began with a coronation ceremony where Erik was crowned king by the archbishops of Lund and Uppsala. The negotiations at the meeting resulted in both a union letter and a coronation letter stating Erik's coronation as King of Denmark, Norway and Sweden. The union letter states that all three realms shall be ruled by one monarch, but the union letter did not unite the different legal structures of each kingdom, meaning that the nations in theory would be ruled quite independently, whilst wars would be fought together and diplomacy would be handled by the crown. There were hopes in Scandinavia that the Union would be able to repel the growing economic dominance that the Hanseatic League had gained in Scandinavia, but the Union would be plagued by political tensions, power balances between old rivals, and of course rebellions. But it was able to be held together for 124 years, but how it all came to an end, well, that's a story for another day.